Welcome to the Dialectic. I'm Atul Singh. I'm the founder, CEO, and editor-in-chief of Fair Observer. With me is Glenn Carle, who is a senior partner at FOI. He's a retired CIA officer, a noted geopolitical analyst. Now, Glenn and I jokingly refer to ourselves as the Rajput and the Wasp because, of course, I'm a Rajput from India. Now, of course, I live in the US. I began life as an officer. I worked in the city of London in corporate law/finance for a wee bit before coming to the US and becoming an entrepreneur. In between, I also did my MBA. And Glenn, of course, is someone who is a walking encyclopedia. He was also a top athlete, and he indeed lives still after retirement in the Boston area. Now, of course, Glenn is a WASP. He is a descendant of folks who arrived in the Mayflower, and I am also the caricature of a stereotype. I'm a Rajput of the Geharwar clan. So we take the mickey out of each other by calling each other the Rajput and the Wasp. So I hope some of you get the humor and the irony and sometimes the self-deprecation. And today, without further ado, the two of us are going to examine Japan, a country both of us love, both of us have been to, although Glenn has been there many more times than me. And Japan, the aging land of the rising sun. Or Glenn put an alternative title, The Setting of the Rising Sun. And today what we are going to do is we are going to examine how Japan has changed over the years, over the decades. No, we won't go back many centuries. We will limit our examination to the post-war period. We will not boil the ocean. And the second thing we'll try to do in this podcast is examine or come up with ideas as to what lies ahead. Glenn, Japan, a country you've been to and a country which you love, and a country where you write a column for Newsweek Japan. And I, before we begin, you must recount that story of meeting the taxi driver in Japan, a story I remember from one of your columns.
Yes, sure. Well, it's the kind of experience one I certainly seek and hope to have, but the conscious seeking of makes it harder to find, because these are serendipitous moments that give you an insight to the culture and create bonds and put you within the society. I was taking a taxi ride in Tokyo to, I think, the National Museum. It doesn't really even matter where. And I don't speak Japanese, and the taxi driver didn't speak any English, but we were talking nonetheless. And somehow it came up that I'm sure I was boasting that one of my then recent columns had been on Seiji Ozawa, who was the conductor of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, who had died not that long before. And so I told him that I had written a column on Ozawa, and that I had relatives who were professional musicians, close relatives, who used to go to listen and see him all the time. And so and then I showed him my article on my phone, which is in Japanese, and the taxi driver was very excited, pulled over, stopped taking me to the museum, and for the next 15 minutes, we had this enthusiastic conversation about how he told me that he drove a taxi because, of course, everyone has to earn money, but that in fact he was an oboist, and that was his love, and Ozawa was a god, and I was somehow, had a celestial aura because I had written about him, and we had this point in common, and I related as best one can through the language barriers the tale of how my aunt and uncle would attend concerts all the time because they were my uncle is a professional director, music director, and my aunt a classically trained with a world-class voice singer, and they used to go for free to listen to the concerts. But at the time, in the 60s, and then I'll stop the tale, Boston was a very different place, and the doyenne of Beacon Hill, the wealthy dames who are of my similar background, would stand up in the middle. They would arrive very late, 20 minutes late, in the concert, bustling, making noise as the concert's ongoing. And then in the middle of the concert, they would stand up and call to their chauffeurs in the back to come and take their mink stoles. And then they would walk out to their chauffeured limousines to go off for tea. And the director preceding Ozawa was a European whose name slips my mind. He would become infuriated by this, frankly, really crass behavior, showing off their status. And my aunt and uncle, gobsmacked, were sitting in the seats, listening and watching the social dynamic. And the reason that's relevant to Seiji Ozawa is because Ozawa was part of a symbol of, but part of the dynamic that changed Boston society from this Brahmin, in the American terms, the WASP elite that condescended to others and defined and made all the rules, to a more pluralistic society where the tinker, the tailor, and the candlestick maker had opportunities that they never had had. It was in some ways in the 1960s to 70s the apotheosis of the American dream, because the ideals of opportunity and merit were being realized. Finally, after 400 years for Black Americans, imperfect as all situations are, the progress then was and remains dramatic. And so Seiji Ozawa was a symbol and a change of this, because he was viewed as someone, well, no Japanese can ever actually interpret Beethoven. Please, this is not possible because he's Japanese. And he challenged all these attitudes because he was one of the finest conductors in the world, of course. So that was what the taxi driver and I talked about as he pulled over and refused to drive me to the Japanese National Museum.
And now, of course, there's a tall Japanese baseball player rewriting the entire history of the sport. You seem to
Yeah, and
like
I've
him a
written
lot
articles
too.
about him too, how he symbolizes, again, and we aren't here to talk about American society's transformations, but truly, he's not just a baseball player. He does embody, in literally and figuratively, dramatic changes in American society and openness and dynamism. And he represents part of the clash of American values and direction that explains the entire phenomenon politically and socially that America is struggling with today, between a traditionalist, backward looking, restorative, attempting movement. And those who embrace the progressive changes and pluralistic growth of American society. So he embodies all of that.
And by the way, his name is Shohei Ohtani. Those of you who don't follow baseball, and he plays for LA Dodgers. So those of our listeners in the UK, in Germany, etc., think of LA Dodgers as the equivalent of a big football club, as in soccer
Well,
club.
he's like
Buying
Pele or Maradona. He's
exactly
unbelievably talented and a gentleman. Okay, let's talk
brilliant.
about Japan.
So now we move on to Japan, and as we often do, we will examine Japan through many lenses. Let's begin with the economic lens. The debt GDP ratio was 62% in 1991. Today, that ratio is 248%. Now, these figures, people may differ in their estimates, but these figures are approximate. So, those of you who have objections to these figures, you can write to us. But the important thing is that this rise is nearly fourfold. Actually, it is exactly fourfold. And the spike in the debt GDP ratio has been partly because of 2007 and 2008 global financial crisis, uh, partly because of the pandemic, the COVID pandemic. But really, if you get into the crux of the matter, the reason why debt has grown is because Japan maintained consistent government budget deficits for decades, averaging about minus 3.04% of the GDP from 1960
And,
to
and
2024.
if I might jump in here, the
Yes,
even Keynesians among us, and I will count myself as a Keynesian. Everyone's a Keynesian to some degree in today's world. Um, will acknowledge or grasp that at some point the debt burden on any government, however prosperous and however efficient its policies, um, it suffers from the crowding out effect of having to um, what's the word? Having to pay for
Service the
the
debt.
service.
Service
Thank
the
you for
debt.
having to
Is
serve. I
that
kept
what you're
having
alluding to?
surf in my head,
Or
having to
too much
service the
government
debt, and
investment
that
servicing the debt?
that takes
Yeah.
away every dollar towards debt repayment is a dollar less spent on building a road, buying a gun, paying for daycare, or funding a university or anything. And the point is heatedly argued when that becomes unsustainable and harms the economy. But there is a point, and since it's the most significant deficit in the world among developed nations, it is a strain, an issue, and something to be aware of.
Yeah. Now, although Japan has the highest debt GDP ratio in the developed world, Japan is lucky in one way. 88% of Japanese debt is owed to the Japanese people. It is denominated in yen, and interest rates are low or zero, which means that unlike, say, a country that has borrowed in dollars, example are Argentina or Argentina, Japan does not face the same financial pressures and the same risk of meltdown and financial crises. Nevertheless, the debt is a big burden, and Japan has the Japanese economy has obviously slowed down, partly because of that debt burden. So, um, if we are looking at Japan, perhaps the important thing to remember is that Japan's GDP rates have slowed down dramatically, and Japan enters a very different period after the stock market declines that begin in 1990, continue in 1991, and by 1992, the Japanese financial bubble has burst. But let's go back to the 1950s. Japan is recovering from World War II. It has suffered two nuclear strikes, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Uh, there's been firebombing of Tokyo. Japan is really on its knees. And at this time, of course, partly thanks to a version of the Marshall Plan, not exactly the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was for Europe, but America had a similar policy for Japan. It invested in Japan, and partly because the Japanese were an organized lot, they had an efficient government. From the 1950s to 1973, Japan sustained rapid economic growth. This growth often exceeded 10% annually. The growth only slowed down after the 1973 oil crisis. We are recording this on Tuesday, the 5th of May, 2026, when we are undergoing another supply side shock, another oil crisis, oil and gas and fertilizer crisis. But in 1973, growth rates, Japanese economy cratered, and growth rates after that became a little more sporadic in the 1980s, and they settled into what is now what are now known as the lost decades, low growth or stagnation or stagflation, but stagnation after the bubble burst. And recent economic growth has often been below 2%. Now, all this low GDP growth, I'll throw one figure out there, has also led to the yen depreciating. In April 1995, $1 bought you 83.6895 yen. That is as per one of the websites, reputable websites I checked just before the podcast. Today, before recording this podcast, I checked that $1 can get you 157.74 yen. So clearly, yen has depreciated and is it's half of its value as it was 30 years ago or 31 years
Now,
ago. Uh,
if I can jump in just for a second, Atul, I'll give a
yes,
little
sir.
teaser here for you and the listeners. or for the listeners, since you and I know what we're going to say. Um, Atul and I seek to understand and then describe the structural reasons for these various issues that we touch upon, whether it's in Japan or whatever the subject is that we happen to be talking about to you all. And there are, I would argue, and I think Atul agrees, clear structural reasons for this dramatic and now sustained decline in GDP growth and increase in debt levels, which we will get to when we talk about the social issues.
Exactly, and we'll touch upon one of the explanations. Of course, there are structural issues, but at the same time, um, we have to hold Japanese economic policies of the 1980s accountable. Often, human societies and indeed even human beings become prisoners of their own success, and indeed sometimes prisoners of their own failures. Uh, we persist with the status quo, even when the status quo is unlikely to work. Um, and in the case of Japan, Japanese policies cultivated the marketability of assets, eased the access to credit, and encouraged speculation, leading to a prolonged and exacerbated Japanese asset price bubble. Now, to get an idea of the extent of the bubble, um, and this is at its peak around 1989, 1990, the theoretical land value of the Tokyo Imperial Grounds, approximately, say, 1.1.5 to 3.5 square kilometers. I've walked around, the palace grounds, so it's not a huge area at all, and this area, its theoretical land value was estimated to be greater than the value of all real estate in the entire state of California. This was one of the largest asset bubbles in history. This is a bit like the tulip bubble
Mhm.
exponentially increased. And the Tokyo real estate was priced over 350 times higher than the equivalent space in Manhattan. So this is very important to remember. This sort of bubble persisted for too long. Neither the uh, central bank nor the finance ministry acted in time. They didn't believe in the adage, a stitch in time saves nine. And by August 1990, the Nikkei stock index had plummeted to half its peak by the time of the fifth monetary tightening of the Bank of Japan, which is the central bank of Japan. By late 1991, and other asset prices began to fall. Um,
But
and by
Atul, you've touched upon the two really important points.
Yes,
The
sir.
specific point, policy decisions that you are describing right this second, and the what you led into after my structural comment, which was actually a structural point, which is, and it's a crucial one for uh, people to apply and have consciously in their attempts to understand why strategic um, dynamics shift. Why, say, the Pax Americana may be passing now, or if it hasn't already, why England declined. You choose the issue. I'll give a concrete one. Um, from the 1860s, 1870 until the 1940s, Montgomery Ward, a large retail shopping store, uh, dominated the American consumer goods market by selling things mail order. That's because they built their business on the possibilities offered by the train, which had become of age, trains in the 1860s and 70s nationwide. They continued that model until the Great Depression. Then they were wise. They constricted and rode out the decade. But when World War II ended, it was literally a different world, and they applied the same model because it had always worked and dominated American retail economy for 100 years. And at that point, the world had changed. There were other competitors, and there were different ways. There are now cars, and thus the birth of shopping malls and individual availability of goods, and Montgomery Ward entered a generation-long decline to extinction. Similarly, everybody in every country. You do what succeeds because it succeeds. And so why would you change? And that's exactly what Atul is talking about on the fiscal and economic policies of Japan post World War II, which were world beaters until the point that I interrupted him about 1990.
Yes, and remember, it made sense. I didn't interject when you were speaking, Glenn. Um, John Maynard Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, never talked about having endless fiscal deficits. In fact, Keynes is often misconstrued. He had argued for um, being frugal in times of plenty and government acting in a counter-cyclical manner,
Mm-hmm.
really, particularly when there was a downturn. So if the economy was doing well, the government was supposed to run a surplus. And if the economy was doing badly, then the government was supposed to run a deficit. In the long run, government budgets would be balanced. However, in practice, what has happened is Keynesian economics has come to mean endless deficit spending because politicians find it really hard to cut um, any money from the budget because they don't want to lose any votes before the election. So similarly, just as that creates one problem, the other problem was for Japan. It did make sense to borrow because Japan at that time had a young population. Japan was growing. Japan was industrializing. Japan was investing in factories. But after 1973, it did not make sense to continue borrowing because the population was aging and yada, yada, yada. So the times had changed, but the Japanese policymakers didn't quite recognize and realize in time that changed times needed changed policies. And let me go back to August 1990 when Nikkei plummets, late 1991, asset prices begin to fall, and by early 1992, they collapse. And now the economy enters, this period of prolonged stagnation for more than a decade. And underlying that is not just poor policymaking, but also a very important issue that you and I have discussed for for months and years. In fact, we were discussing just before we started recording this podcast, and that is the workers to pensions ratio, demography, which basically is a feature of demography. So if we look at 1950, there are 12.1 workers for every pensioner in Japan. This is a very young population. People are having lots of kids. This is a time when post-war recovery is filled by a young, productive, hardworking, and disciplined population. Um, Remember that demography is no guarantee for economic growth because India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh are producing plenty of babies. They don't see economic growth like Japan. They choose populism, socialism, whatnot. But really, the place which is seeing growth is Japan because it has young workers, but also because these young workers are hardworking and are skilled. 1970, the workers to pensioner ratio goes to 9.8 is to 1. Um, this is the height of the economic miracle, but it is also the beginning of the birth rate decline. Birth rates are starting to decline. By 1990, when the stock market starts declining, there are 5.8 workers for every pensioner. This is the peak of the asset bubble. And ironically, at its very peak, the weaknesses of the society become manifest. Society begins aging rapidly. And note, by 1992, I mentioned that Japan had, by 1992, the Japanese asset values had basically cratered. And yet, in 1993, a movie came out in America called Rising Sun. And this is apparently a classic. This had
I was going
none
to
other
mention
than
it.
Sean Connery and Wesley Snipes. And it was all about Japan, the threat of Japan, and Japan perhaps taking over the world. You probably remember the movie, Glenn.
Very clearly. I was going to talk about it. Well done.
Please, please, please do.
Oh no! Yeah, well,
Uh,
you're saying exactly what I was going to say. It's a cultural marker. Japan in from the early '70s, from the oil shock of '73 on, certainly up until the early 1990s, was viewed as the world beater. And I remember having somewhat heated discussions with contemporaries who were from Stanford on a train in Europe that the Japanese model, and they were expressing the views of the day among the elite, that the Japanese model of economic development and social organization was the way of the world, and if we didn't adapt and adopt, that we would be destroyed. To look at the data, and they are taking over the automobile industry. They're more efficient in every way. They have new processes in factory organization, labor, and finance,
they had a Kyo Morita and the Walkman,
and the
Sony.
and so we had better all start speaking Japanese literally, and this was the way of the world. And so the fears of American decline and Japanese the rising sun becoming the noonday sun were pervasive, and it was quite impressive and daunting to see one industry after another that had been the American dominated become Japanese dominated, and thus
And
the movie represented the fears of American decline and Japanese supremacy, certainly, and it wasn't a one-off. This was the cultural attitude of the
yeah,
era.
this was the zeitgeist, and it was ironically 1 year too late, 1 year after the collapse of the bubble. And this is also a time in the 1980s when a real estate developer called Donald Trump starts voicing grievances, and these grievances are voiced against Japan, and he
That's a
says
very
that
important point. That's a very important point because many people will not remember this at all. But I do remember this, and exactly as you
yeah,
say, Donald Trump has changed over 40 years. He has changed one word essentially. He's moved west or further east, which both are true at the same time. And instead of denouncing how quote the Japanese are laughing at us, now he says the Chinese are laughing at us. But otherwise, his argument of economic nationalism and fear of the other, fear of domination from, it turns out, the East, is unchanged, verbatim.
exactly. So, so it's interesting to see that these fears did exist and still persist, although now replace Japan with China. And going back to Japan, by 2010, there were 2.8 workers for every pensioner. The impact of the lost decades was such that aging became a national crisis. And in 2026, there are approximately 2 workers for every pensioner. And now this is crisis time. This economically is uncharted territory for any economy anywhere in the world. And actually, this has no precedent in human history because generally human beings have procreated in larger numbers. And Japan, in some ways, is a bellwether for what the rest of the rich world or the advanced economies will experience. Um, so that is, in a nutshell, in a very quick nutshell, the economic backdrop to what has changed in Japan. Over to you, Glenn, about the political changes. Please, enlighten us.
Well, Japan, since it was one of the two great losers of World War II, uh, had all of its cultural guideposts either rejected, suppressed, or placed into question. And they were occupied by the United States for many years. And America set out very explicitly to remake the Japanese political system in the American image. With dramatic success, and at the same time inability to change the fundamental nature of Japanese society. So that was 1945, where everything is placed into question. If anyone reads any Japanese literature or social studies of Japanese society from the immediate post-war period, it's fascinating to see, and tragic, of course. The wars are tragic, to see an entire culture question its founding values and in some ways unable to state them and to argue over them, since the occupier, and that shouldn't be taken pejoratively, I would argue in this instance, wouldn't allow um, a an open reckoning with the nationalist Japanese right, because that it was the nationalist Japanese right militarism that had, frankly, led to Japan's destruction, war in China, and the Asian part of the entire World War. So that was all suppressed for decades. And Japan, like Germany, could express itself or devote its energies by turning to economic development and social reform, but not political expression, and certainly not projection of any Japanese interests or will beyond its borders. However, with the demographic changes and the economic changes in the structure of Japanese society that Atul was just talking about, the two-generation long decline of the worker to retiree ratio, two-generation long decline, which we'll talk about shortly when we get to the social issues, of birth rates, and the receding of the immediate recollection of and traumas of the war, as Japan becomes a very civil, law-abiding, domestic and international partner, economically and politically, attitudes change. And then, in particular, the issues that Atul was describing around 1990, which is really when the tide turns, you could argue, and the pressures start to become to reverse, and whereas growth and opportunities were increasing for the Japanese individually and socially, from that period on, just as America becomes paranoid about Japanese supremacy and other parts of the world too, uh, the Japanese start to have to deal with increasing pressures, if not restrictions, nonetheless lowering rates of growth, lowering margins to cover social expenses, and so on. And what happens then in every society? People start to question the profligacy and how do we explain what is happening to us? And one tends to look for an other to blame, and that's an easy thing for a nationalist right to turn to. It's the post-imperial order. It is the imperial actions of the white hegemon. It is the turning away from the values that led us to great success. These are all standard tropes of any conservative national reaction to increasing social constraint and diversity and challenge. And so we've had a resurgence in some ways of a nationalist Japanese right, which says, well, we must be proud of who we are, and we must be able to make our own decisions. Well, and who can argue reasonably against either of those assertions, or whoever you are, wherever you're from? And so we now, and then as the fetters, the constraints on Japanese agency, on Japan's ability to make its own decisions economically and politically and internationally, you find people now being accepted into the mainstream of Japanese political and social discourse, arguing for what have traditionally been viewed as nationalist positions, which implies centralizing control in the in the central government, and an assertive um, assertive policies for nationalistic aims internationally, and a call for Japan to be able to exert its will, which means that one has to have the military means to do so. And so this is what is happening. And you have the key figure, Atul and I think in this, is Shinzo Abe, because he sort of is the coming of age of the
So
acceptability of the traditional Japanese right, and
brilliant.
he argues for a more assertive Japan, which is the current.
If I can
Yes,
interject,
please.
let's turn the clock back to 1955, and then place Shinzo Abe in the context of Japanese politics, because in some ways all politics is local, all politics is domestic, but and yet it isn't. That's a cliche, which is partly true but not entirely true. I say that as the nephew of a late politician who was the general secretary of the Socialist Party, but completely believed in free markets or crony capitalism. But we won't digress into that field. We will go into 1955, because the 1955 system is what basically defines Japan. What is the 1955 system? Well, two conservative parties, the Liberal Party and the Japan Democratic Party, merge. Why do they merge? Because they want to form a united front against the Japan Socialist Party. And this coalition, this merger, this party that emerges is a very broad coalition. It's a center-right party. It is a conservative party. Its critics
Fundamentally
joke
arguing that we represent Japan and the socialists represent Moscow or Beijing.
exactly, exactly, and this is a party that supports Japan's alliance with the U.S. It fosters close links between Japanese business and government. By the way, this party is dominated by an English upper class like elite. Most people who are members of the LDP elite, and that is why its critics always joke it's neither liberal nor democratic, are part of basically a Brahmin elite that rule through consensus. It is a very consensual culture, but there are factions nevertheless, and Japanese prime ministers don't tend to last that long. Anyway, long story short, this party does provide stability. It presides over the Japanese economic miracle, which we've already described, which lasts from the 50s to the 1970s. You have the first, initially led by Ichiro Hatoyama, and you have prime ministers like Hayato Ikeda, Aisaku Sato, Kakue Tanaka, Takeo Fukuda, Yasuhiro Nakasone. You probably remember him, Glenn. Anyway, the the long and short of it is that the LDP is weakened only when the Japanese asset price bubble bursts, and the LDP does lose power in 1993 and 1994, briefly. And this is when a
It's the
certain
only
figure,
time, however, really in the post-war period, that the
yes,
LDP, this party you've been describing, lost really controlling power.
yeah. And this, when it loses power, then somebody called Junichiro Koizumi, in fact, he teams up with Taku Yamasaki and Koichi Kato. So this is a younger generation, and they form the Shinseki group, um, and they are known as the YKK Trio. They form the Shinseki coalition, and they try to reform the party's internal structure and leadership. So, what do? Well, what they do is that Koizumi makes a bid for LDP presidency in 1995 and 1998. He does win in 2001. I remember Koizumi, dapper, elegant man, famously once danced with Richard Gere. And what they want is They want, if we are going back to what Koizumi wants, he wants some neoliberalism. The Soviet Union has collapsed, and he focuses on reducing Japan's government debt. You can argue he's the only one who really tries it. He privatizes Japan Post. He also sends troops, and this is super important. He sends Japan's self-defense forces to Iraq. And this is the first time.
That's the first time since World War II that Japan
First
could
time
act
since World War II.
beyond its
Exactly.
border.
Exactly. And partly, of course, he's helped by, by the fact he's popular. He in 2005 he wins a landslide, and all that is good. But there is a dark side to the Koizumi premiership. He visits Yasukuni Shrine, and this fuels tensions not just with China, not only with China, but also South Korea. Koizumi resigns as prime minister in 2006.
May I interrupt just for a second to
yes,
help
please.
the
Yes,
context
please.
that you're adding? So why has the LDP dominated politics, and who are they? And I'll go take a step back further than you went. The Americans decided, this was Douglas MacArthur, the occupying ruling authorities, the United States, decided after the war that they had to have someone to work with to hold the society together and to keep communism from taking over the social political control of Japan. And so the Americans, did not even attempt to break up what had been the ruling elite, which had been the militarist descended from samurai warlord class that had dominated Japanese politics for generations. And they tamped down the militarism. The United States did. But as the American control eased, as Japan became more stable and prosperous, it had always been this party that was in power, and the more assertive nationalist elements of it started to reemerge in the period that you mentioned, Atul.
Yes, and going back to Junichiro Koizumi, he was a third generation politician. His father, Juniya Koizumi, was the Director General of the Japan Defense Agency. He was also a member of the House of Representatives. His grandfather, Koizumi Matajiro, was called the Tattoo Minister. He was because he had a large tattoo on his body, unusual, and he was Minister of Posts and Telecommunications. So Koizumi comes from a posh upper class family, and he's succeeded by Shinzo Abe. And Shinzo Abe was the grandson of Prime Minister Nobusuke Kishi. This is a man who is as blue-blooded as you can get. And of course, he had studied in the University of Southern California, and very much when Abe comes to power, he comes with ideas, and one of the ideas is Quad in defense, which you will expound upon, Glenn. He comes up with this idea to counter economic stagnation with Abenomics. He also worked on the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Now, just to clarify, you've jumped ahead here from the 90s to Shinzo Abe, who was, in our view, a transformative or historically significant prime minister. Most Japanese ones have not been, but most leaders are not. And Abe was prime minister twice in let's see, from 2006 to 08, I would guess, and I forget the exact dates, but he was prime minister until 3 or 4 years ago and was assassinated 2 or 3 years ago now. I have the dates slightly off.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I'll go through the timeline. He replaces Koizumi. He's Koizumi's heir. He becomes Japan's youngest post-war premier, the first one born after World War II. He's also part of the ultra-nationalist organization Nippon Keigi, which downplays Japanese atrocities in textbooks. denies government coercion in the recruitment of comfort women. But in 2007, he initiates the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue with US, Australia, and India. And the whole idea of the Quad is to resist or to contain China's increasingly aggressive policy, foreign policy and defense policy, and contain China's rise as a superpower. He makes a comeback. He resigns um, because of unpopularity and illness in 2007, if I remember correctly, and he makes a political comeback in 2012. That I do remember, and he wins a landslide then, and he becomes the first prime minister to return to office since Shigeru Yoshida in 1948. And that's when he comes up with Abenomics, which is, loser fiscal and monetary policies to kickstart growth. Doesn't quite work, and he resigns. He resigns in 2020, and so we are now up to the end of Abe, and now let's talk about Sanae Takaichi, who also loses the leadership election before before coming to power, and she is very different to both her predecessors. She is not upper class. She's working class, middle class. She is the first woman. Um, and she is very much in the nationalist tradition of Koizumi. So the reason the reason I have gone into all of that is to give some color, and I'll avoid getting too much into the weeds now, and we'll move on, Glenn. And
So
let's
we've touched upon,
yes,
I think, the rise of the nationalist right and the evolution of Japanese politics. I guess our takeaway is that the nationalist right has always been there, and the economic pressures, in a ironic sense, have liberated the nationalist right to express, or at least successfully politically express, the shift in Japanese society and constraints. Is that fair to say?
yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and in a way they've reflected just the normalization of Japan after a few decades of foreign domination, because both
Yeah.
Germany and Japan, in some ways, are normalizing and reverting back to historical mean.
So I mentioned, and you've touched upon too, you've described this political evolution of liberation and, ironically, a resurgence of the always dominant conservative party now to an even more nationalist expression. Um, I wouldn't take away from that one should be frightened in the nationalist terms. For someone of my generation, nationalism can allude immediately to, or bring to mind immediately, the horrors of World War II. It needn't be that, but there are militarist elements. But let's talk about the social transformations briefly, because those are really what have led us to this political evolution. You touched upon the changing ratios of workers to pensioners, which is a critical element affecting economic wealth and opportunity for the government to address issues or be constrained. And this gets to the demographic evolution of the population. Japan, once again, is in many ways a leader in its demographics. The Japan's current population, I believe, is 120 million. Projections are that by the year 2100, so only 75 years from now, one lifetime, Japan's population will be 80 million, a decline of about one third. Uh, Japan's population is declining in absolute numbers every year, and has for, I think, 15 years or so. The natality rate is gosh, I think it's 1.2 or so children per female. Uh, replacement rate we know is 2.1. Do you have the data at hand, Atul?
Yes. Let me read it
Yeah.
out so that it'll make. Then you can comment on the significance of the data. So absolutely, I have. The fertility rate is 1.1.4 or 1.5 in 2024, and this is well before 2.1. Let's. I'll give you the numbers really quickly. The elderly 65 plus are 29.8, let's say 30%, rough around 30%. The estimate is 29.8 to 30.1%. So let's put the number 30% round off. The working age 15 to 64, I repeat, 15 to 64, that is about 59%. Youth, that is 0 to 14, they're only about, say, 11% of the population. The median age is about 49.4 to 50.2. Let's round it up. Let's say 50. It's the second highest in the world after Monaco. Life expectancy is 81 years for men, 87 to 88 years for women. Roughly 1.1.4, as I said, children per woman, and the highest total dependency ratio in the world of 70.2, meaning there are roughly 70 dependents, youth and elderly, for every 100 working age people. I think that's about enough statistics. We don't
Yeah.
need to drown people with data.
So what happens? All of these things have profound, obviously, it should be obvious, social consequences, then political consequences, and economic. An example from the United
Yeah.
States. America has always been characterized, at least it has for 175 years, as this innovative society of mechanics. Tinkerers, inventors, and so on. That was the 19th century reputation. And there was truth to that. But why was there truth to that? Well, partly it had a very educated population relative to the rest of the world, and it had capital and so on. However, it had a tremendous labor shortage. It was expanding dramatically across the continent. And even with a high birth rate, it did not have it could not meet the demand for labor. And so you look for labor saving devices so you can run your business and provide the services and products that you need. And therefore, New England, in particular in the United States, became the New England Yankee. Thus, uh, Mark Twain's The Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, written in the 1880s, about this innovative and clever mechanic from Connecticut in New England, who went to King Arthur's Court in England and wowed the backward European English society because he knew practical things like how to invent different things. Well, in the Japanese context, this is actually part of the dynamic of Japan's society. They have a tremendous labor shortage, and they similarly are highly educated and organized and have capital. And so what happens is the Japanese have been leaders in technological innovation and labor-saving devices, in inventions, and in their
May I
economy.
very quickly add to what you're saying? So, even when they had post-war abundance, meaning they had 12 workers for every retiree, even when they had the demographic dividend, because there was such massive growth, this workforce was not enough. So they needed rapid industrialization to meet demand for Japanese goods around the world. And the transition that happens from 1970 to 1995 as life expectancy increases and birth rate falls, then the Japanese really become great at just-in-time manufacturing, they pioneer robotics. They are really at the cutting edge of efficient manufacturing, not just using machines, but using machines most efficiently. The entire mastery of the supply chain that everyone else has adopted was actually pioneered by the Japanese. And
Right.
now that we are in this age from 2000 of the super aging society, the Japanese are indeed pioneering robots. I remember walking around Osaka. I have two memories from Japan. I'll share one and I'll share the other at the end of the podcast. And I remember walking along the river on a weekend after a conference was over, and there were robots doing all sorts of things. There was a robotic competition at the local university, and all these young kids with their robots doing various things. And I was blown away because I don't see such things when I walk around Italy or India.
So, whereas we had the Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court in 1880s America to embody the labor shortage and thus the innovation drive in the American economy and society. Today, perhaps we should have the Japanese samurai and the New England town green, because the dynamic is quite similar. However, one also has wondered, well, why has the Japanese growth rate slowed from these astounding figures over the decades to the last 30 years now of basic relative stagnant growth? And that also is directly the function of the demographic shifts to old age, an older population in Japan. People who are between 18 and 64, I forget the exact figures economists use, 18 and 45, perhaps it is, buy durable consumer goods. They have families, they have careers, they have needs. They need a washing machine, they need a car, they need a home, they want to go on vacation, etc., etc., etc. People who are my age, retired age people, don't have these capital expenditures. They don't spend as much this way. They have more savings, which they use on medical care, fundamentally. And that lowers the growth rate. Japan has an early old society relative to other societies in the world. And so the growth rate really reflects the demographics, not any failing of the policymakers or of intrinsic difference in quality of and desires of the society. It's a function of their age rate and their worker to pensioner rate. And this creates tremendous challenges and issues for any society and government to address. And this is Japan. They are ahead of the United States. America thinks that has understandably thought of itself as somehow sui generis and unique, and we don't have these problems, but our growth rate has been slowing. And why has our growth rate been slowing? Over time, not from failures of Republicans or Democrats. Fundamentally, it's because of the slowing birth rate of American society. In 1956, I was born, and the fertility rate was 3.6 children per female. And by the year 2000, it was 2.1, which is replacement rate. And today it is 1.55, not that far from Japan's. And America's growth has been directly the function, and we aren't here to talk about America, but has been directly the function of its immigration, which is now largely being stopped. But that is, as we
And
say, another issue.
speaking of immigration, that is a far trickier issue in Japan, and Japan has been averse
Absolutely.
to allowing immigrants into Japanese um, into Japanese territory compared to the US. The US is a land of immigrants, and that's a major difference. And Japan is largely homogenous, and to some degree, Japanese reservations are indeed true. If you had a lot of immigrants, then Japan would not have the social discipline, the social cohesion, the cleanliness, just the tranquility that you see in Japan. That's partly a
Well,
result of their homogenous society.
social conservatives. There's the counter argument that it's the dynamism of a
Yeah.
pluralistic, diverse society that leads to its successes. But the
Yes.
Japanese have clearly decided historically to adopt the position that you just enunciated.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay.
Look, I mean, one anecdote we move very quickly on. The Japanese say, sometimes when you get immigrants, say you get them from India, and quite often they won't stand in a queue, or they won't be as orderly as the Japanese. They won't be as much on time. Similarly, when you get Muslims, they want their own burial grounds, and they want halal food and other stuff. And the Japanese don't really. Japanese society is not really geared for that. And proselytizing, of course, is another thing that that raises their hackles. But let's move on from the domestic and immigration to the international, because that is what is
So,
worrying Japanese policymakers and many of our friends.
so as Japan has freed itself from, we could say, the shackles or the constraints of post-war an imposed post-war moderation or domestic focus, and as its social and economic uh, structure has evolved so that the pressures on availability of investment funds for the government and growth rates have slowed and tightened. At the same time, the world beyond Japan's shores is radically evolving, as we are all aware. And you have the rise of the behemoth across the Taiwan Straits of China, and the relative turmoil and turning inward of the United States. So, what is Japan? And in the context of a now much richer and more potentially capable Japan. So, what happens internationally for Japan? You were going to say something, Atul. Sorry.
I was saying that our last podcast, for those of you who have not heard it, is on China and Taiwan, the China-Taiwan dispute. And a number of our articles, my last article was on China-Japan tensions. So this is something we've covered, and we've covered for years. We were one of the first, and I apologize for sounding immodest, but we were one of the first who said that the joint Russian-Chinese fleet sailing around Japan would be a watershed moment, because this was the first time a fleet had sailed around Honshu, the main island of Japan. I said that this was akin to someone walking outside your door waving a pistol, and it would inevitably lead to a Japanese reaction, and it has. Over to you, Glenn.
So, I think what I'll do, or what we'll do, is to combine and present as one both the international context and the military changes that Japan has
Yes.
undergone. The latter can't is irrelevant without the former. It is a direct response to it. So therefore, so you have a rise of China and America going home in a certain way, or at least less able or willing to enforce its positions within the umbrella of which is Japan than heretofore.
Uh,
So what has Japan done?
I'll just jump in before you carry on. Our Japanese friends in Tokyo, and indeed even our Korean friends in Seoul, have been deeply distressed by the moving of military equipment as well as troops from South Korea and Japan to Iran in the context of the US war on Iran. Uh, this has raised fears in East Asia again, that the Asia pivot that Barack Obama promised, that this whole idea of taking on China is superseded by American entanglements worldwide, and particularly in the Middle East. And therefore, really, the Chinese, the Koreans, and the Taiwanese have to fend for themselves.
So what has happened? And some of this, at least from the Western perspective, and the American one, which is an even narrower one in some ways, you have a really coherent, aggressive, and comprehensive series of policies in response by Japan to try to compensate and address for these changes. Internationally, Japan has aggressively moved to replace, to the extent that it can, because Japan doesn't punch at the same weight as the United States. No one does yet, still, and won't for probably past my lifetime, which I hope will be decades. International leadership, or at least active counterbalancing of China's growth. The single greatest counterbalancing policy that the United States embarked upon to counterbalance the rise of China was the Trans-Pacific Partnership and Economic Agreement for multilateral trade rules, embracing essentially all states in Asia and South Asia. And Donald Trump canceled it. He withdrew the United States from it, in his first day of office in his first term. This was, frankly, disastrous policy because it unilaterally withdrew the United States from Western Asia in many ways. Japan's response, however, was to immediately, this is under Shinzo Abe, or Abe Shinzo, the prime minister at the time, was to negotiate the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, a much less pitchy name than TPP, which was the American one, but CPTPP. In any event, a a trade agreement of the same nature without the United States, the intention of which was to create rules that would moderate and bound in some ways China's rise and foster free
And by
trade
the way,
without Beijing's
by the way,
hegemony.
this counters the China-led Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP. So this is
Right.
China, has one move on the chessboard, and Japan has countered it with another. Of course, China is the bigger power, the hungrier consumer of commodities, and so has greater weight. But nevertheless, the Japanese
Right.
have not been idle. They have responded to our RCEP. Over to you, Glenn.
Absolutely. Similarly, China has its much touted and significant One Belt, One Road initiative to link China's economy with the other end of the Eurasian landmass, which is with Europe and with the Middle East and with Africa and with the whole world, frankly. Um, the figures cited at the beginning of this were several hundreds of billions at the least of dollars of investment. China has realized its own boundaries and constraints and has reduced the amount of money that it's willing to expend on this. Nonetheless, what response was there? The United States had some articles written, and the government has done largely zero under Donald Trump. Well, the U.S. response was to impose trade barriers and tariffs, but that's another issue. Japan's response has been to invest, I think it's 150 or 200 billion dollars in Africa to counterbalance the investments that China has made so that China doesn't make all of the rules. Now, Japan, once again, cannot replace what the United States could have done or was doing, but it is truly of historic importance, the measures that Japan has taken explicitly with regard to trade and with regard to development in Africa. And it's not just development to help children learn to read and write, which is a wonderful thing, which they're doing, but also economic development and therefore opportunities for Japanese or other businesses. Similarly, it was Shinzo Abe who invented, created, fostered the Quad that Atul spoke about before, which is a discussion group at the very least of consisting of Japan, Australia, India, and the United States. Now, I was on a number of interviews with Russian counterparts of mine on television in which they accused the Quad of being, and me of being, an agent for a NATO in Asia. And wasn't this horrible? And the Japanese and the Indians had best be aware of what was happening. This was yet more American hegemony. And my response was, actually, I hope that you are correct, because it's hardly a NATO at this point. It's not a defense alliance, but it is the kernel of one. And it's these four members are critical for South China, for South Asia and for the South China Sea and for Asia in general. And they were discussing what? Things that everyone will agree on to start without being provocative, such as pharmaceutical development, and then nascent trade regulation rules and export and import supply chain coordination, and then some nascent defense discussions also. Everyone has their own reservations about this, but it is an aggressive diplomatic strategic response initiated and frankly led by Japan, because the United States is not any longer doing this sort of thing. I'll turn to the military and try to be quickly. Japan's restricted itself under American pressure since World War II to have a defense force that could not be deployed, could only defend and attack on its own land since World War II, and to spend less than 1% of its GNP on defense. Even with that restriction, Japan has had in the last 40 years one of the 5 or 6 largest and certainly most capable militaries in the world. However, since Shinzo Abe in the last
Very, very quickly, let me add
yeah.
one point to what you're saying. Japan said it would raise its defense spending to 2% of the GDP, and it is on track to do that by 2027. And it was part of a plan they announced in 2022. And importantly, the Japanese cabinet, end of December 2026, approved a record defense budget of 100 million yen, 640 million to deploy unmanned air, sea surface, and underwater drones um, to contain China. This is just one expenditure alone at the end of December. So Japan is ratcheting up expenditure and not just buying equipment from outside, but developing its own equipment. And the seawater drones is a classic example of Japan trying to find ways to work around limited uh, youth, limited population, limited numbers in military strength. Over to you, Glenn.
So even with the 1% restriction, we'll call it, Japan's military and its expenditures on military ranked it fifth, maybe, after the United States, Russia, China. After that, it may well have been Japan. Even before the defense increases that I'll iterate in just a second that I'm talking about now, Japan has the largest navy. No, let me say this. Japan's navy is larger than the Royal Navy of Great Britain and the French Navy combined already today. However, as Atul said, they're doubling their defense spending. Japan is. They are now acquiring what they are calling counter-strike capabilities for the first time. Japanese defense officials used to tell me, the problem is that you, Americans, have restricted us to being able to shoot down in the water, but not across the water, meaning that America, as it has done since World War II, has encouraged or constrained allies to have anti-submarine warfare capabilities, but not power projection kinetic capabilities, not the ability to strike, but the ability to protect the American aircraft carriers. That is changing now. Japan is purchasing 300 Tomahawk missiles, which are a counter-strike capability. It's one of the most powerful, accurate cruise missiles in the world, if not the most powerful one, that has a range of 1,500 kilometers or so. And so now they can strike, not just defend. They are changing their security doctrine. This is the subject of all sorts of angst and anger, much of it artificially generated in Beijing, when the Japanese leaders say that an attack on Taiwan is an existential issue for Japan, which may oblige the Japanese military to become involved. That's a revolutionary change. I mentioned the Quad Alliance. Japan is also engaged in strong bilateral discussions on military issues concerning with Vietnam, the Philippines, Australia, and the United States still, of course. The issue being the sovereignty of the South China Sea and the growing Chinese Navy and military capabilities. And we should all keep in mind that the Chinese Navy is the largest Navy in the world in absolute numbers, and the quality of its forces and its technologies have become from second rate to peer rivals at the least with the United States. U.S. aircraft carriers, as recently as 1995, could sail directly off the coast, a few kilometers off the coast of China, and impose American will or express American positions. American aircraft carriers today operate 1,000 or 1,500 kilometers off the shore of China because of the increase in Chinese military capabilities. You have the free and open Indo-Pacific doctrine that the Japanese have enunciated. This is their version of freedom of commerce of the seas in international waters. This is a direct counter to China's increasing assertions that it controls all of the waters off the Chinese coast, extending out, frankly, 1,500 kilometers in contravention of international law. And you have the hardening of islands all around Japan, not just the Japanese mainland islands, but in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and in the Pacific, hardening them with missiles, garrisons, munitions, visits by Japanese defense forces regularly. You have the creation of an expeditionary force, the Japanese equivalent now post World War II of Marines, U.S. Marines, that can deploy to assert Japanese will and power wherever it wishes. That's not happened since 1945. All of this has happened in the last decade. Japan now has, it claims not to have any aircraft carriers. In fact, it has two by another name, on which F-35s will be able to land. F-35s are the most advanced aircraft in the fighter aircraft in the world at present. And Japan is buying, I think, 150 of them. I forget the exact number. So all of these are dramatic shifts, not noticed by, certainly noticed by Beijing, but not noticed by the American media, and assertions of Japanese independence, will, and capability in direct response to the changes in Japanese society, politics, and the international context.
One quick correction before we crack on and look at what this means going forward. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, the biggest spender on the military is the United States, about coming to nearly $1 trillion as of 2025, 954 billion actually. Then followed by China, 336 billion. Number 3 is Russia. Number 4 is Germany. Number 5, India. Number 6, United Kingdom. Number 7, Ukraine. Number 8, Saudi Arabia. Number 9, France. And number 10, Japan. But these figures are misleading because a lot of the bigger armies spend a lot on pensions and salaries, whilst Japan's expenditure is going into technology, into capability building. And so Japan may actually punch way above its weight or way above its rank. So what does all of this mean going forward? Well, politically, we see continued assertive nationalism, as well as at some point some kind of painful decisions, because as of now, Sanae Takaichi, to use Glenn's words, has been promising Christmas for everyone all the time. And that will simply not continue. So eventually, the lady who claims to be a descendant of Margaret Thatcher might very well be succeeded by a Margaret Thatcher in economic terms, which brings me on to the economics. Economically, what do we expect? We expect a continued slow relative slide, simply because Japan will not have as many people, Japan will not consume as many products, Japan will not be as important a figure when it comes to investing abroad or global trade. And so it will remain a wealthy country, but it will become more of a middle power, despite its military and its foreign policy assertion. Militarily, as Glenn has clearly enunciated, Japan will become a globally ranked military that can project power. I repeat, project power. And our friends in the Japanese Navy are very confident of Japanese naval abilities. Often they say off the record that they could match the Chinese because they are much more organized and they have that technological know-how. And so militarily, we will see more confidence. Internationally, what is likely to happen? Well, Japan will have to replace the US with variable coalitions to counterbalance China. Now, the Quad has not met Japanese expectations, partly because India has been uninterested in having anything to do with defense, and India has its own domestic problems with 1.4 billion people. So the Japanese have been looking increasingly to South Korea and to Taiwan, and you can see the Japanese are stationing missiles on Yonaguni Islands that's next to Taiwan, and that is because the Japanese will deepen relationships where they can, and indeed they have done joint exercises with the Philippines. So they will have variable coalitions, and a lot will depend on how the coalition partners behave. But internationally, Japan will become more assertive. Socially, even though the LDP, which is a conservative party, opposes immigration, and Sanae Takaichi certainly does, at some point there will be increased immigration, and
There
indeed
has to be.
there has to be.
Yeah.
And there'll be dramatic investment in robotics. Now, having mentioned that the Japanese resist immigration, I also have to say that all my friends who've immigrated to Japan are extremely happy there and sing paeans to the quality of life in Japan. So, I must also point that out in this podcast, because a lot of times people assume that the Japanese are hostile to foreigners, and that is not an experience I've had. In fact, I will give a very quick anecdote of my experiences in Japan. Each time, people have been singularly helpful in pointing me the right way. At a train station, I dropped my water bottle thrice. Once, an elderly lady with her daughter, made her pick it up and run after me to hand me over. The second time, I was in the office, superintendent's office, and I dropped my water bottle. I was very tired, and they ran all the way to give it to me. And the third time this happened, a third person did it whilst I was getting out of the station, out of my destination. But most importantly, I ran into a young physics student who had finished his exam, Saya Shinakwa, and not only did he miss his train, but also he made sure I sat in the right train. He was on his way back from taking an entrance exam in Nagoya. And very few countries have this level of helpfulness, courtesy, warmth, and hospitality. So, yes, when we say that Japan is averse to immigration, we also have to point out in the same breath that if you go there as a foreigner, you do not feel this sense of hostility or lack of safety that you do in some other parts of the world. So, and they will have to have immigration. There's no other way. In terms of grand strategy, as Glenn has said, they'll have to contain and deter China. They have to avoid fighting or boycotting it, because it would be economic Armageddon if Japan and China go head to head. I talk about
and there's no fighting. No one can fight gravity. And the fact is that China is a behemoth. China will continue to grow. China has 1.4 billion people, and even with its absolute population decline every year, 50 years from now will still be 1.2 billion or 1.25. And so every country in the world, and particularly those in Asia, will have to accommodate in some to be defined ways Chinese aspirations and will.
And the Chinese themselves have declining demography. So eventually the Chinese, Japanese, and South Koreans will all be grappling with, and the Taiwanese will all be grappling with similar problems.
Absolutely.
And now,
what will happen then? As you said, increasing immigration is certain. Massive investment in robotics is certain. Continued relative stagnation, despite technological leadership and excellence, is, I think, unavoidable, given the demographic realities of Japanese society and progressively also Germany and Hungary and Italy and the United States and Western Europe and all economic societies. Stagnation doesn't mean that growth and technology and lifestyle and opportunities don't increase, because they will. But that if you have a stagnant population, you aren't going to ever have growth rates unless AI turns out to be this manna from heaven, and I'll believe it when I see it. That just is a reality of demographic stagnation. It means a lower GDP growth rate per annum.
So 5 to 10, 25 years from now, Japan will face an existential choice. What is that choice? Well, number one, perhaps come under the Chinese strategic and economic orbit. Number two, maintain the American, Japan, and other Asian nation counter alliance. And number three, actually, create replacement to the extent possible to the Pax Americana in Asia. This will probably mean not just an entente with other non-Chinese Asian states, but perhaps a détente with China, which hopefully remains pragmatic and practical and sees the economic benefits of the relationship that it has with Japan and indeed its neighbors. Of course, history is convoluted, and it tells us that nothing is straightforward, nothing is linear, and we might well be fools for trying to look into the crystal ball. But on the whole, we think that this existential choice is going to define Japan. And given the choices Japan has been making recently, I suspect the Japanese will try to replace Pax Americana with a Pax Asiana that is a bit more multipolar and a bit less certain than today. But certainly that has a chance to succeed. Over to you, Glenn. Famous last words from you.
Well, I think that's you've summarized it pretty well, actually. I'll just point out that we've been talking about Japan, but and I speak a lot about structural, not determinism, but constraints and directions that come from structural issues. However, I'll point out that China's obsession with Japanese militarism is a very conscious choice, largely, not only, but largely by one man, and that is the leader, Xi Jinping, at present. Many Japanese officials indicate off the record, not in public, that they know that this is a conscious lever that is pulled when Chinese leaders have a need for national cohesion or to divert attention or to unify policy and so on. And that it is over 80 years now since the war, and that Japan has no hegemonic aspirations or intentions to recreate 1931,
Or
and
indeed
that policies will
capability,
change.
or indeed capability. They simply do not have the numbers to come all the way to India. Lest we forget, I served as an officer in Nagaland, which is where the Japanese forces were finally turned in the Battle of Kohima. There was the Battle of Imphal in Manipur, just south of where I was, and the Battle of Kohima. And the Japanese are not coming again all the way to India. They simply do not have the numbers.
They won't. So, but for one man, in a number of instances, policies can be radically different, and nothing is eternal. So, I think the third option of an increasingly influential Japan in a more not harmonious but less um, singly framed international system is if one had to choose, the most likely evolution of the next generation.
So, in a nutshell, Japan will become more nationalistic, but it will not turn into 1930s militaristic version of itself. And Pax Asiana might replace Pax Americana in the not too distant future. Thank you very much, Glenn, for a fantastic conversation. Those of you who have enjoyed listening to us, make sure you follow us on whatever platform you're using, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Send us ideas as to what we should speak about. And please sign up for our newsletter at fairobserver.com. Until next time, bye for now.
Sayonara.